I'm Meredith Clemens. Thank you. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
A little sleepy after this sandwich. I'm Meredith Clemens. I'm a student here at the University of North Carolina in the Communication Studies Department in the second year. And it's a pleasure to see you and have these presenters. This panel specifically focuses on lessons in equality. Thank you. So we're going to be doing questions afterwards, so jot them down, take note of them, and then we'll open it up to questions after Dan finishes speaking. Also, if you want to take a moment to turn your cell phone off, we would appreciate that as well. So our first presenters, I'm going to go ahead and announce all of you now, your titles of your abstracts and where you're from, and then we'll begin with Mark and Melissa. So our first presenters are Mark Cogdon and Melissa Wheeler. Kelvin is not in attendance. Mark and Melissa are from the University of North Carolina at Greensboro, and their abstract title is Teach for Democratic America, or Teach for Corporate America, a rhetorical analysis of TFA's influence on the charter school movement. Here we have Justin Rudnick from Ohio University. The title of the paper he'll be presenting is Equality Equals Visibility? Questions. Fostering an LBGTQ-Friendly environment in academia. And then lastly, we have Dan Subotnik from Touro Law School. The title of his paper is marked incorrectly, so here's the correct title. Do tests matter? Richie, the bar exam, the LSAT, and the racialist challenge to learning. After Justin finishes presenting, I'm going to pass out a handout that Dan's prepared for you. So while he's introducing himself and his paper, I'll go around and do that. So now we will begin with Melissa and Mark.
So we wanted to start today by giving a little introduction to ourselves and why we were interested, particularly in this project. My name is Melissa Wheeler, and I am a doctoral student in the Counselor Education Department at UNC Greensboro. I was actually a former elementary education major, and I'm from the Eastern North Carolina region, which many of you may know is a very economically depressed area. And former elementary education major turned counselor. Mark is actually a former Teach for America Corps member. He served with Teach for America for 2 years and as a special education teacher, and then later taught in Eastern North Carolina for a year as a special education teacher. So we actually, one day in class, started talking about North Carolina lifting the charter school cap from 100 charter schools to now unlimited charter schools, and really started talking about school choice and the issue of school choice, and really the school choice movement and where it started. So the school choice movement really gained popularity with the A Nation at Risk report, and McIntosh actually analyzed the A Nation at Risk report and said that this was really a turning point for education, where the education rhetoric and education debate shifted from talking more about issues of political and social equality to education as a way to ensure the economic prosperity of the United States. And Kuhl pointed out that this was really a point too where education started emphasizing individualism and accountability through testing. So thinking about that, raising the charter school limit in North Carolina, and then talking about, with Mark, about TFA's influence in Eastern North Carolina. So there's 16 school leaders in Eastern North Carolina, and of those school leaders, two charter schools have been started by Teach for America alumni, and one is run by Teach for America alumni. So that really got us interested in how is Teach for America really influencing the charter school movement, particularly since Teach for America Corps members are really encouraged to be education activists and to emphasize the values and ideals of Teach for America long after their service has ended.
And so before I go and define the ideology with which we use to analyze the artifacts, the Teach for America Eastern North Carolina region is one of the first regions that Teach for America started when the organization was created back in 1990. So the Teach for America has had a large presence in North Carolina, and it's one of the oldest in the country. So there is significance considering that Teach for America has been here for a long time and that alumni of Teach for America are now starting to lead the schools in that region. So before we begin, I'm going to define ideology and how we saw this with our research. And Foss defines ideology as a set of patterns or beliefs or assumptions that by which a group operates. So basically the goal of an ideological criticism is to uncover or expose the role of communication in creating or maintaining the ideology within that group. So to start off, we first wanted to come up with some research questions. So we have two specific research questions that we looked at. And the first was, what is the ideological view of Teach for America manifested in the charter schools that were started or led by the alumni of Teach for America? And then the second question we wanted to answer was, whose voices are represented and oppressed in this Teach for America ideology? So what we have found is we looked at the Teach for America website for our artifact, and then what we wanted to do is to see what ideologies were embedded within the Teach for America website that then translated into these charter schools that were managed or run by the alumni. So we then looked at the charter school websites to see if there was any similarities, differences, and what ideologies were embedded within the messages that were being communicated. Excuse me. So then what we have found after analyzing, we discovered that there were three common themes and ideologies within. The first was dealing with this notion of committed leaders or individuals. The second ideology we found was this notion of them being a Teach for America charter being an education revolution. And then the third one is an overarching ideology. Within these two other ideologies that we're talking about is this notion of market-driven policies, beliefs, and practices. So basically within how they see committed leaders and how they see their education revolution is all very market-driven and market-based. Excuse me. So within, the first one we're going to talk about is committed leaders. And with that, by looking at the Teach for America website, they really emphasize when they're trying to recruit core members joining the core, they really emphasize trying to recruit individuals who have a track record that is outcomes oriented. So certain questions that they ask for on their website and that they emphasize is leaders in colleges who have accomplished results or who had some type of accomplishment. Another thing they emphasize is overcoming obstacles in face of adversity. So basically in challenges that you face as a college student or in any other career that you've had, how have you handled those, and were you able to achieve the results and the outcomes that you had? And the other thing that they really emphasized was basically recruiting people who had similar values and beliefs of Teach for America and utilizing the skills and resources that Teach for America emphasized. That is something that they really emphasized on their websites, especially specifically when trying to recruit the core members.
And in the charter school websites, we found a similar theme of the committed individual, committed leader, and the committed leader as the head and spearhead of the schools. For instance, on the charter school websites, we found that the principal has the power to hire, fire, change the curriculum at will, without input from community members or teachers. They also, on the websites, there were contracts for the teachers and the parents to sign, but not for the committed leaders to sign. And so, in looking through these contracts, we realized that the committed leaders were the ones developing the contracts. Therefore, the teachers and the community members served, the parents, and even the students had no input in the contract they were being required to sign. And furthermore, the leader didn't have to sign it. So we found some issues of equality and power structure there.
And then the second thing that we found with an ideology was this notion that Teach for America is this education revolution. And in order to understand and really figure out if Teach for America is a revolution that they say they are, we need to define revolution. And ARTS defines revolution as, he explains that as, to be a revolution, movements, classes, and media must challenge power to be revolutionary. One cannot govern from below. There can be no grassroots social transformation without replacing existing power. So using that as a framework, we then define, in order to be an educational revolution, you need to have a sudden change or radical, you need to have a sudden, radical, or complete change in educational power, where freedom, equality, and equity are sought. So when analyzing the websites that we found that Teach for America isn't really necessarily a educational revolution, because they're really perpetuating a lot of the market-driven values and policies that are being emphasized in current educational reform, such as race at the top, very data-driven, market-driven, standardized testing. So, but it's at more of an extreme level. So though public schools tend to focus more on data-driven instruction, standardized tests, the Teach for America emphasizes to a greater extent, and this is shown through their website by the test scores being thrown of the core members all over the website with the progress that their students have made, and also basically being very data-driven, emphasizing data-driven instruction very heavily on their website, and using that for the pedagogical practices that their core members are to use to close the achievement gap.
When we took a look at the charter school websites, we also found this emphasis on test scores as a means to accountability, and very data-driven instruction, many graphs and charts about how the test scores are raised. And, but also we found that policies like school uniforms really end up, sorry, I'm trying to articulate this. So even with a place like school uniforms, there were only 2 businesses where school uniforms could be purchased. And that serves to marginalize populations that are already marginalized by the public schools, because what if you can't afford to buy a school uniform from this place, or if you can't afford to buy more than one school uniform?
And then within that too, within the charter schools, they really also emphasize like this notion of rewarding your students with like a paycheck. So students are basically paid to get the results that they want. And within that too, so basically within this revolution, we've also found that Teach for America sees education and reform as more of like a business, a practical business. So, and then that was also manifested in the language and the policies that was emphasized on the websites in the charter school, treating these charter schools as a practical business, and their objective is to get certain results on these standardized tests.
And we found that actually the principals were the ones who were getting to award these paychecks and decide what, in quotes, hard work was to get your paycheck every week.
So then basically what in conclusion, we basically find that by focusing on these market-driven approaches, and it basically limits the voice of the students, teachers, and other community members, where Teach for America is going into these communities and are having an influence. These charter schools are going into these communities, but they're not engaging community members, parents, or necessarily the teachers, and so they're not necessarily always taking the culture into context. So things like culture responsive pedagogy, utilizing strategies with that, having more of a democratic leadership method, and incorporating voices from outside organizations is really not emphasized on the websites or prioritized, is not really mentioned. So we find that this could continue to marginalize students they're trying to help, because by focusing on this one type of approach to close the achievement gap, it limits the voices of these students by basically making them robots to get a certain outcome on the test without really trying to take into account the culture and context of where these schools and where our students are coming from. And some other future research that we wanted to look at is, so Teach for America is very big here in the United States. However, there's this organization called Teach for All, which was also started by Wendy Kopp, who started Teach for America, where Teach for All goes into developing countries such as Pakistan, China, and India. So they're then implementing this Teach for America westernized model in these developing countries. So further research is needed on exploring that and how those certain market-driven policies and practices, how does that translate in these cultures that may have different values.
just going to stay sitting. I feel like it's more comfortable for me. I'll just get awkward and unarticulate if I try to stand up and do this. As you folks know, my name is Justin Rudnick. I'm a doctoral student at Ohio University. And I wanted to start just by giving you a little bit of background on the project that I'm going to talk about today. The paper that I put together is an extension of some of the work that I did for my master's thesis. And so the thesis in particular focused on the experiences of LGBTQ instructors coming out in the classroom from the teacher's perspective, because I felt like going into the research, a lot of the stuff that's out there, especially in communication education or instructional communication, focuses on the impacts on the students. So I wanted to see what the teacher's perspectives were on some of that stuff. So I did some qualitative interviews. I was looking to see how they felt that coming out in the classroom affected their instructional effectiveness, how it influenced the relationships they developed with their students, and so on and so forth. And my first interview participant mentioned a really bad experience that she had with her colleagues in her department. And that got me thinking that maybe there was something more to this issue that I should probably explore for future ideas. And so I added a couple questions to my tentative interview list, and then I went into the rest of the interviews to find out perceptions of LGBT instructors in terms of like safety and security within their departments, institutions, and kind of a system-wide assessment of how comfortable they felt there. And I found some really interesting things. So just a little bit of context before I go through this. The interview data that I have was conducted with 7 self-identified LGBTQ instructors. I didn't find any trans folks, which is an issue in and of itself. And they were all at various ranks, so I interviewed some adjunct instructors, all the way through associate professors, all from different departments, but from the same Midwestern university. And so that's just to kind of frame where some of these responses are coming from. What I'm hoping that I'll do then is just kind of go through 3 different, I don't want to call them themes, but I don't know what else to call them, so we'll go with themes for now. To kind of give you an overview of the mix of positive and negative experiences that folks related to me, and then some dichotomies between the way that the university fosters support for LGBT students as opposed to faculty members, and then whether they thought there was a dichotomy between departmental support and then bigger institutional or system-wide support. So to start with, there were a mix of positive and negative responses that I got, and a number of folks said that they had really great experiences just across the board, that they never felt like they were overtly discriminated against. They felt like their colleagues provided a really safe, really comfortable, very supportive and open environment for them, without question. But I do want to share with you the negative experience that tipped me off to what some of these research questions might be getting at. So I'm just going to, if you're okay with this, I'm just going to perform some of these narratives for you, and so we'll work through these and see where we go. So this is from one instructor, and she said, "A week after the first time I came out at all, we had a department social, and I had a male student come up behind me and grab me and like push his whole body into me. And I was talking to another faculty member, and we were at Buffalo Wild Wings, and I actually thought it was just like a guy at the bar kind of doing that, and I turn around and it's this student. He was not in my class, and then he kind of walked away, and I said to the other faculty member, 'Did you see that?' And he said, 'Yeah,' and he was horrified about it. We took it to the department, and I wanted to bring the student in and talk to him about it, and the department told me no, that I really couldn't do that, and I needed to let it go. And I know that it was connected. And then he was in another class with another male student that I had, and him and the other male student came in to tell me that on my evaluation, he was writing down that I hated men, that the 2 of them had been tracking how often I called on them in class as opposed to the women. And I had 3 men and 27 women in the class, and they were sort of tracking this stuff. And I suggested that perhaps he maybe pay attention to the class and not just track. And he had been a student I had had before and had no issues with prior to this. So those are kind of the 2 pieces that have come out of this. And the most disappointing thing was when I went to the department to talk about how to get some support for this, I got none. And basically wasn't overtly told that, kind of get over it, but pretty much. So I've come to recognize that we can talk about being supportive of faculty that are diverse in different ways, but that doesn't actually happen. And to me, this really shook my perspective going into the thesis research, because this happened to be the first person that I interviewed, and then that story just kind of came up organically, and I'm like, what do I do with this? So I decided to pursue some of these questions a little bit more. Other folks had really positive experiences with coming out and being out in their department, so let me find a snippet for you here. This came from another instructor who'd been out for a while, different department, and he says, I mean, but it is what it is. So I feel like there is, even though I'm not super connected with sort of the other professional gays on campus, beyond the one that I live with, I know that there's a pretty supportive environment from within that. So while I have not necessarily felt like I needed the support that that would offer, I know it's there. I think I have confidence that the department or the institution would have my back if something were to happen. I don't perceive the institution as looking for a way to get me out, or to, sorry, you can go only so far in this institution because you're a homo. Like, I don't get that. And again, I think academia is a little more open than other fields might be. I think there's a lot of great diversity programming on campus that I really don't engage in all that much, but not for lack of it being there, just not as much of an interest. I've never been to a gay event in town, so I think that they are policy-wise, though I do have some questions about their domestic partnership stuff, but that's more of a system issue than campus. Some of that kind of stuff. But I generally feel like the policies and procedures are non-discriminatory based on my perception, and I've never had a battle that would reveal otherwise. And then I'll just share this one last snippet with you. Another professor said, I really feel like this is a university that is very accepting. We are, after all, the second oldest LGBT center in the nation for university levels, which is amazing. And the director, who's the runner, the president, the grand poobah, is just incredible and completely committed, and I feel like it's an open place to be. So as I was working through the interview transcripts and talking with these folks across departments on campus, I was getting two really divergent ideas and pictures of what the campus climate looked like for LGBT instructors. And so as I started to dig through these a little bit more and do, I guess those of us who work with narratives call it thematic analysis, whatever that means. There started to arise this dichotomy between how supportive the university was for students as opposed to how supportive it was for faculty. And I think you folks have heard that a little bit in the stuff that I've read. I have another transcript quote here that I think puts that into really good perspective. A different instructor that we have not heard from yet before says, I think they do a pretty decent job for students. Without the LGBT center, I don't know that we would necessarily have that. So it's nice to see, like when I walk down that end of the hall, to see lots of people in that common area outside the center. And I know many of the people that are there are LGBT, and I know that many of them aren't. And they're sitting next to each other, or near each other, or whatever. So that seemed to be a good thing. And we have the lip service, diversity and that type of thing. We don't have anything that supports faculty and staff. So students, I think we do a great job with. Faculty and staff, I think we have no support whatsoever to foster any kind of community that way. Which I thought was really interesting. And I probably should have mentioned this a little bit earlier as part of the context thing, but the university that I interviewed these folks at did have, as you know, the second oldest LGBT center in the country, which is kind of fantastic. And my perception was very similar to this one, that they did a lot of programming stuff that targeted students. And so I think I would have had very clear but very different feedback if I had interviewed students as opposed to faculty, because there were a lot of folks that get really involved with the center where I was from. The faculty, though, and he wasn't the only person who said this, had similar experiences, that the faculty and staff didn't so much seem to be targeted by some of that programming, which they assumed was a reflection of the climate of the campus. So in addition to that dichotomy between how supportive the university is for students as opposed to faculty, there was another dichotomy that I found between departmental and university-wide support. And so here's something that I'd like to share for you because I think it's really insightful. This instructor said, I just don't think it's on the radar. Yeah, I just don't think it comes up. I don't know, my second or third year I was here, I think it was the first year that the director of the center was here. And she tried to, like a gathering of some kind for faculty and staff and got academic affairs to pay for some treats, but it wasn't very well attended. So I don't know. I think it's just not on their radar, really. I mean, and a lot of it's probably more, this is all just my perception, but having watched the way that the administration has rewritten job descriptions, I don't have a sense or belief of any kind that our administration's collective support of anything to do with minorities is really altruistic or a sense of, true support for the diversity as it is wanting to attract those populations for the numbers so it looks good, for the bragging rights. So that's kind of the sense that I get. And I don't know that that's bad. I can't think of it. I don't see it as any kind of sinister plot or anything. I think it's more like almost a clueless way of trying to do it. Just like a typical white person way of thinking, doing something good for Indians. That's the way that I kind of see the way that our administration has handled some of the things related to anything with any kind of minority, no matter whether it's people of color or gender or sexual orientation or anything like that. So that was a really, I thought, interesting perspective university-wide. I have very divergent opinions on departmental stuff. So here's an example for you. This instructor said, I feel safe being here. I don't feel like an oddity. But at the same time, I don't feel necessarily protected in the sense of the law. I can still be dismissed. If I had a partner, I'm still not given the same rights as one who can legally be married without it costing me more money, the way it is with my heterosexual peers. For example, if I had a partner and we wanted insurance, it would cost more than if I was in a heterosexual relationship. I still don't necessarily, I would have to seek out additional things if I had children or a partner who wanted to go to school or some other things, which I think are additional hoops that our heterosexual counterparts don't necessarily have to do. Now, I'm not involved in a relationship, I don't have children, so it's not something that I have to deal with, but I know it's something that's alive and real with other members of our community. And it's not solely from the university, I think it's system-wide, it's the larger system. And it's outside necessarily the realm of what this one institution can do. It's more about the legislature and what they're willing to do for their LGBT employees. And until that changes, it's just going to be what it is. They'll say, well, regardless of the protections that are in place, it's basically just a little bit of a song and dance. And then there was another instructor who said something a little bit more pointed in terms of the overall experience with the department. Let me find it here. So this person said, just absolutely, it's a positive experience from top to bottom. I felt accepted from the second I got here, and it's never waned. If there's a faculty member who's ever used the term gay wrong, or they ever said something or whatever, I feel completely comfortable. And this has never happened, but I feel completely comfortable with saying this is what you're saying, this is how you're using it, this is how it needs to change. But it's just absolutely been a positive experience. And so there's this very divergent view that kind of came out of these interview transcripts, where a lot of folks said, the department's fantastic, the university's apathetic, the system seems to just not care. And I thought that that was really interesting. And so working through these then, I kind of found these different tensions. So if I asked myself, what does equality for LGBT faculty look like? There's the distinction between department and university system. Who's responsible for fostering the visibility? Who's responsible for fostering that support? Does it come at a micro level? Does it come at the meso level? Or is it a more macro level issue? Then there's also the idea of, should it be offered by the institution, or is it something that LGBT faculty themselves need to create? So there are a lot of people who talked about how the university doesn't offer it, the department doesn't offer it, the system doesn't offer it. But there also didn't seem to be a lot of folks who were taking proactive steps to create that for themselves. And I think that that's telling of something. I don't know what, but I think it was an important distinction to make. And then the last question that I have, and so I'm speaking in theoreticals here, is visibility important? And so the title of this project is, does equality equal visibility? And I don't know if it's visibility or if it's recognition that folks are looking for. And I think that there's a difference between saying we are here and between having other people say we see you. And so I obviously have very strong opinions on the issues that arose, and I could tell you what I think about this, but I think that would be besides the point. I think if I were to ground any type of conclusions in the data that I have, I don't think that I could offer you anything. The point, I guess, is to keep us thinking, and hopefully through dialogue like this, we can arrive at some kind of idea as to what this equality is supposed to look like. But in the meantime, I'm hoping that these little bits of narrative that we've shared, and I can give you more examples later on if you'd like to, I'm hoping that this will get us thinking more about what does equality look like for populations that are marginalized or stigmatized on our campuses, and what needs to be done, and not just from higher levels, but what can we do?
Thank you, Justin. Next is Dan Subotnik, and as you begin, I'll pass these on.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. My name is Dan Subotnik. I teach law at Touro Law School, where I've been for the last 30 years or so. I have written extensively in the area of race and gender. I'm going to speak about race today. And the title of my talk is Do Tests Matter? Ritchie, the Bar Exam, the LSAT, and the Racialist Challenge to Learning. To frame my talk, in keeping with the theme of this conference, you might think of the title as, does equality equal test results. I'm going to suggest to you that there have been a large number of challenges recently to testing in a variety of different contexts, some of which I'm sure you're familiar with. I'm going to be talking about other kinds of testing. I'm going to suggest to you that this is destructive. It undermines equality rather than furthers equality. In short, I'm going to say that I am against change rather than for change, although obviously against change in a couple of specific areas, not generally. I wouldn't want to get thrown out before I even start. Okay, so you all have I think you might all have a handout now. Take a look at the beginning of the handout. Even if the bar exam were a valid screening device, one would have to ask whether the disproportionate impact on people of color could be justified. This is from a SALT statement, Society of American Law Teachers, a major left-leaning organization, the major faculty organization on the left in the law school setting. Now, their mission to make the legal profession more inclusive and more reflective of the great diversity of this nation. I'm going to be talking about in a minute, but I do want to say something about RICCI, R-I-C-C-I. This is how I got into this matter, and you might feel the same way when I tell you about this case. This was a Supreme Court case decided in 2009. It involved some firefighters in New Haven, Connecticut, who wanted a promotion. Is anybody familiar with this case? You know, a couple of people who wanted a promotion. So they gave an exam, and a large part of the exam, 60%, consisted of multiple choice questions. 40% was other things, simulations, and so on. The city gave this exam. There were no minority firefighters who passed the exam and who qualified for promotion. So the city said to the white firefighters, sorry, we cannot validate this exam. You got to start all over again. The white firefighters were appalled. They started a lawsuit, and in a couple of years it ended up in the Supreme Court. And in a very, very hard-fought battle, the white firefighters won. The Supreme Court directed the city of New Haven to promote the white firefighters. This was a 5-4 decision, and it generated an enormous amount of controversy in academia and outside of academia. Newspapers all over the country reported on this and took positions. I knew at that time, when that decision came down, that I had to write about this, and I actually have done that. I was appalled. It reminded me of a situation when I was a kid, and I was something of a jock as a kid. And you know, you'd play a game, and then you'd score a point on a basketball court or on a baseball field, and somebody would say, "I wasn't ready. Do-over." Right? I'm sorry, do-over. Now, maybe this is a male thing. Do-over doesn't work, right? Unless you've really got a very strong basis for it. Nevertheless, 4 Supreme Court members and a lot of academics have weighed in on this, saying, "Sorry, we have a big problem in this country. It's a racial problem, and you got to give it up. Do-over, start again." But the Supreme Court said no. Now, there's another. If you take a look at the next handout, it's by Derek Bell, late, very prominent critical race theorist at New York University Law School. Once their research skills are in place, students are aware that they have the capacity to learn relatively quickly whatever they need or want to know regarding any legal question. I'm going to talk about that in a couple of minutes. And now, how do we interpret the quotes that we have so far, that you've looked at so far? As I interpret those quotes, I come to 4 different conclusions. Number 1, race is above all. Race is the axis on which the world should turn. Number 2, the public needs no protection. If you go to number 1, we're talking about the bar exam here, even if the bar exam. So the world doesn't need any protection. The public doesn't need any protection. We don't need a bar exam. Number 3, the bar exam is not a valid screening device. Notice the use of the subjunctive in that first quote. Even if the bar exam were a screening device. And number 4, this is now going back to Derek Bell, we learn by doing. Everything can be looked up. Testing of knowledge is therefore worthless. The emphasis is on skills. Now, to me, there's something terribly ironic about this, and that here are law professors who are bashing knowledge. The knowledge that is reflected on a bar exam, whether it's valid or not, we'll talk about in a minute, the knowledge that is reflected on a bar exam. Now, I don't know what the motto of this university is, but I spent some time at the University of Chicago in the past, and their motto is, in Latin, crescat scientia vita excolatur. Let knowledge unfold and thereby enrich human life. So it's a different idea here, and mainly with a view towards protecting minority students, as I'll show in one moment. So what SALT did in its statement that I referred to is look at bar passage rates, and it found that the white bar passage rate was significantly higher than the black bar passage rate. And if you look at the LSAT scores, white scores are significantly higher than black scores. And if you start with the assumption that race comes first, race above all, then your conclusion has to be the bar exam has to go, and the LSAT has to go. Now, there's a lot more to be said, and I'm going to talk about that. The first thing is about the bar exam. We have a terrible problem in this country. You undoubtedly talk about it in your classes. We do not know how, in general, to educate black people in this country. The educational gaps are terrible. They start in the 3rd grade. There's a standard deviation, a full standard deviation difference in black and white 3-year-olds when they are tested. And these disparities continue, and they continue through elementary school, they continue into high school. The average black 12th grader reads at the same level as the average white 8th grader. This is a function in large part, as I conceive of it, of the terrible schools that we have in large parts of the country. But that's not the whole story. If you want to get a picture of what happens at the best schools, the best high schools in the country, you might want to look at a book by John Ogbu, O-G-B-U. He did a major study of the Shaker Heights school system outside of Cleveland, and this book was published in 2003. The grade point average persists in college, and it persists in law school. And that disparity is enormous. Now, you would think that if you were giving a test for entrance into a learned profession, and we think of law schools as a learned profession, that the same disparity that showed up at the very beginning of their lives would continue and would be reflected at the law school level as well. And if that's the case, you can't say that the bar exam is not valid. In that case, you cannot say it because this gap is reflected throughout the academic development of the children. You have to come up with some other arguments about the bar exam if you want to undo the bar exam. Now, in fact, the attacks are growing. I promise you there's going to be an attack, a legal attack on the bar exam in the very near future. In the New York City school system, we have a phenomenon where a test is given to anybody who wants to enter into the elite schools. One test, 3-hour test, yes or no, nothing else, no recommendations, no nothing else. And a complaint was recently filed before the United States Civil Rights Commission that this test was illegal on the grounds of violation of Title VII, and this is going to go through the works now, perhaps into the courts, and who knows what the result of that is going to be. There have been challenges to testing for teachers and other kinds of challenges to testing. Now, I'm not suggesting that the only basis for challenging the bar exam is the disparate performance. The bar exam is not a perfect test. And there have been other kinds of challenges, one of which is that, and it's reflected in the Derek Bell quote, that you don't have to know anything, right? All you have to do is have research tools, because now in the computer age, everything can be looked up. Well, clearly that's not true. Clearly you have to know what to look up. You need to know how to interpret what you look up. And so you can't simply look up questions. We understand that. We've, kind of adults who operate in the in an educational environment know that. You've got to be able to formulate the questions precisely, and then do your work, and then formulate the results, and then interpret the results that you have. Other arguments against the bar exam: multiple choice questions are not realistic. Sure, that's true. You don't get multiple choice. Your client doesn't come in and give you a multiple choice test. That we need more research and writing skills to be tested on the exam. But in fact, we have essay parts of the exam, we have research parts of the bar exam, and it turns out the students do equally well on all the different parts of the exam. Consistently well or poorly, depending on who they are. So it's not the multiple choice that is responsible for the relatively poor bar performance. Another challenge is that the bar exam doesn't reflect empathy for the client. Now, you folks here talk a lot in communications department about empathy, and you're right to do so. We don't talk about it in law school, and we're wrong to do so. But the problem is, how do you measure empathy? How do you develop empathy? How do you measure it? And if you can't measure it, then you can't do anything with it insofar as bringing students to law school. Of course, we do something with it. It's just not reflected on the bar exam. It's not reflected on the LSAT. We ask for recommendations and for experience, community building experience, and that tells you something. But you can't pick that up on a bar exam or on an LSAT. Now, to be sure, multiple choice questions are problematical, but they serve an advantage. We live in difficult times in terms of racial relations. Undoubtedly, it's better now than it's been in recent years, and hopefully it'll even get better. But a large fraction of the lawsuits coming before the federal courts are race and gender cases. Racial discrimination. I didn't like this, I didn't like that, and I'm not saying one way or the other whether these cases are valid or not, but a large fraction. These are tense times. They're also tense times because we have economic problems now. So if there's a setback at work, one of the things you look to is to the courts. Now, why am I telling you this? I'm telling you this because, as a practical matter, the objective test solves that problem. Okay, the objective test says that your grade is not a function of the kind of question you were asked, nor the grader, and so therefore it serves the purpose of objectifying, of keeping down the challenges to exams on racial and, in part, gender grounds as well. The other thing is about the bar exam is that it doesn't really matter whether you have to know torts or contracts. The point is you're given an assignment. The assignment is master these materials. You may not need those materials in your practice, but even if you don't, you're given an assignment. Make sense out of these materials and analyze these materials. So in effect, then, the challenge to the bar exam, that it doesn't really measure what you need to know on the job, is not realistic. Your job as a lawyer is to read and to master reading material and to interpret reading material. Now,
5 minutes.
all right. Okay, underserved communities. This is a big issue. Okay, yes, we need more lawyers to represent underserved communities. There's no question about that. The underserved communities are not being served properly in the United States. There are some solutions. The question is whether those solutions are tied to the bar exam or not. In the medical profession, for example, a lot of functions have been peeled off and given to other folks, medical assistants, I don't know, there are other terms, medical, what are they?
Nurse practitioner.
Nurse practitioners and other things. And we're about to do that in the law field also. And hopefully, what's going to happen in the near future is the public will be much better served as a result of stripping away these functions. Quickly, the LSAT. The LSAT predicts 25% of first-year grades. And the challenge is, again, it doesn't measure agreeableness, conscientiousness, neuroticism. How's that? I love neuroticism. Because which way does it point? Do you want your lawyer to be neurotic or non-neurotic? I remember my wife is a professor, was a professor at a graduate school in music. I remember a student she told me, a student was dismissed because he wasn't neurotic enough. He was dismissed. Why was he dismissed? He wasn't neurotic enough. He didn't want to make a career for himself. He wasn't on the make for a name for himself. So, but I think the interpretation here is different. So agreeableness. What do we do with agreeableness? How do we measure it? Now, one of the things we can do is we can give Dale Carnegie courses. Some of you may not know that. I don't know. How do I translate Dale Carnegie courses?
How to win friends and influence.
Yes. How to win, yes, what I'm saying. Is that still around?
Yes.
Okay, that's good. Another claim is that the LSAT doesn't measure grades of African American students. And my response to that, and the reason it doesn't measure grades is because there's a hostile learning environment in law school. That's an outrageous, from my perspective, an outrageous claim. There's never any support for that. But that explains why African American students, that ostensibly explains why African American students don't do as well. But of course, if that's the case, then the LSAT overpredicts rather than underpredicts grades, and the LSAT is a benefit. But of course, it's terribly destructive to say that, and I'm sure you understand that. The real problem is grades. LSAT bar exam are tied to grades. If you're going to undermine the bar exam, if you're going to undermine the LSAT, you're going to undermine grades. And nobody's willing to say that grades are unimportant. So how seriously can we take the folks who want to challenge the bar exam? I'm out of time. So let me finish by telling you what I want from you. Okay, I gave this paper yesterday at my school. This is a quote. Oh, and you have it at the bottom of the list. If racial equality is America's goal, then reducing the black-white test score gap would probably do more to promote this goal than any other strategy that commands broad-based political support. Reducing the test score gap is probably both necessary and sufficient for substantially reducing educational equality and earnings, and in crime, health, and family structure. We shouldn't bash the tests. The tests tell us something. They don't tell us everything. They tell us something. We have to work on the underlying problem. How to work on that, I have some thoughts about, but I'm out of time. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you to our 4 participants. And I just have to comment that all 3 of these presentations were just magnificent. So I appreciate very well prepared, concise, strong, and very insightful